Here's a paradox. The Air Force once destroyed this idea on purpose, canceled it, grounded it, physically cut apart the aircraft built to prove it. Decades later, that same discarded idea became the most expensive, most secretive, most radar-invisible aircraft ever built, one so fragile that ordinary moisture could bring it down. This is the untold story of the B-2 Spirit. The aircraft the Air Force killed on purpose. Start with a strange fact and sit with it for a second. Somewhere in America, in the late 1940s, Air Force officers made a deliberate decision to take a working aircraft. One that had already flown, already carried a crew, already demonstrated its underlying concept, and order it cut apart into scrap. Not because it crashed, not because it failed a test, because the institution had simply lost faith in the entire idea behind it. That is not usually how a design earns a second act. Ideas that get physically destroyed by the people meant to champion them do not, as a rule, come back. They become cautionary tales, told in engineering schools as an example of ambition outrunning capability. They do not, 40 years later, become the backbone of American nuclear deterrence, a black-painted ghost, capable of slipping past the most sophisticated air defense network on Earth without ever being seen. And yet that is exactly what happened to the flying wing. The aircraft we now call the B-2 Spirit is not really a new idea. It's an old idea, one specific man's idea, rejected so completely that the Air Force didn't just cancel it. They destroyed the physical evidence that it had ever flown. Understanding why that idea failed the first time, and exactly what had to change in the world before it could succeed the second time, tells you almost everything you need to know about why the B-2 turned out to be one of the strangest, most expensive, most operationally fragile weapons the United States has ever built, and also one of the most important. Let's go back to where the idea actually started, decades before anyone had heard the word stealth. Chapter 1. Jack Northrop's Impossible Vision. In the late 1930s, aircraft designer Jack Northrop looked at the conventional airplane, fuselage, wings, tail, all bolted together in the shape every child still draws today, and concluded that most of it was, in his eyes, a mistake. His reasoning was almost insultingly simple once you hear it. A normal fuselage exists mainly to hold things together and carry a crew, but it produces nothing but drag. A tail exists to provide stability and control, but it adds weight and drag without generating a shred of lift. In Northrop's mind, an airplane that was nothing but a wing, a single lifting surface doing the work that three separate structures normally split between them, would be inherently more efficient than anything else in the sky. It's the kind of idea that sounds obvious once someone says it out loud, and nearly impossible to actually build. Northrop spent years chasing it anyway, and by the 1940s, his vision had become real hardware. The XB-35, a piston-engine flying wing bomber, followed by the jet-powered YB-49. Two aircraft that looked like nothing else in the American arsenal. No tail, no fuselage in the traditional sense. Just a broad, sweeping wing carrying engines, crew, and weapons, all within its own structure. Here's where the dream collided with 1940s technology. Removing the tail didn't just remove drag and weight, it removed the natural aerodynamic stability that a tail provides. A conventional aircraft, disturbed by turbulence or a control input, tends to want to return to level flight on its own. The tail surfaces act almost like the fletching on an arrow, keeping the whole airframe pointed the right way without much help. Strip the tail away, and that self-correcting tendency disappears. The flying wing was, by nature, unstable in the air, constantly wandering off its intended flight path in ways a human pilot had to physically fight to correct, moment by moment for the entire duration of a flight. For test pilots flying the XB-35 and YB-49, this wasn't a minor annoyance. It was exhausting, dangerous work, requiring constant manual correction just to hold a straight course, an enormous cognitive and physical burden layered on top of every other demand of flying a brand new experimental bomber. Every gust of turbulence, every small asymmetry in engine thrust, translated into the nose or a wingtip drifting off course. And there was no automated system standing by to catch it. The correction had to come from a human being, reacting in real time, for the entire length of every single flight. With nothing forgiving the moment, their attention lapsed. And exhausting, unpredictable aircraft eventually produce exactly the outcome everyone fears. A YB-49 was lost in a fatal crash. A separate YB-49 suffered a landing gear collapse on the runway. 2 serious incidents were enough. The Air Force's confidence in the entire flying wing concept collapsed along with the aircraft, and the program was canceled outright. Then came the detail that turns this from an ordinary program cancellation into something closer to an execution. Rather than simply mothballing the remaining airframes, the Air Force ordered them scrapped, physically cut apart, and destroyed sometime in the 1940s. Whether that decision was driven purely by aerodynamic disappointment or, as some have long suspected, by contractual and political friction between Northrop and the Air Force at the time, the practical effect was the same. The flying wing wasn't shelved for later reconsideration. It was erased. Jack Northrop, by most accounts, never fully recovered from watching his life's central idea be taken apart, bolt by bolt, on the order of the very institution he had built it for. He had spent the better part of 2 decades arguing that the entire aviation industry was building airplanes the wrong way, and the one moment he finally got to prove it at scale ended not in vindication, but in a scrapyard. That should have been the end of the story. An idea proven unstable, a program canceled, the hardware physically destroyed, so there was nothing left to even reconsider. Ideas do not typically survive that kind of ending. This one did, because 30 years later, the world changed in a way that made an aircraft's ability to be invisible suddenly more important than almost anything else in aerial warfare, and the flying wing turned out to have a hidden advantage nobody in the 1940s had ever thought to look for. Chapter 2. A sky that had become impossible to survive. Jump forward to the 1970s and 1980s. The Soviet Union had spent decades building the most sophisticated integrated air defense network the world had ever seen. Layer upon layer of early warning radar, long-range surface-to-air missiles, and high-speed interceptor aircraft, all networked together into a system designed to make sure that nothing entering Soviet airspace went unnoticed for long. Every conventional strategy American bomber planners had relied on was, one by one, being closed off. Flying high and fast, the approach built into aircraft like the B-2 and the supersonic B-70 program no longer offered meaningful protection. Soviet radar and missile systems had simply grown capable enough to track and engage aircraft at those altitudes and speeds. Flying low, hugging the terrain to slip beneath radar coverage, had been the next logical answer. But even that door was closing. The MiG-31 interceptor entered service with look-down, shoot-down radar, specifically engineered to pick low-flying aircraft out from the ground clutter that used to hide them and bring weapons to bear, regardless of altitude. Consider what that actually meant for American strategic planning. Every physical trick available to a bomber, go higher, go faster, go lower, had a Soviet countermeasure waiting for it. There was no remaining combination of altitude and speed that reliably got a bomber through. If a bomber couldn't outfly or outclimb the defense network, the only remaining option was to make the defense network unable to find it in the first place. Not evasion, invisibility, that requirement, an aircraft the enemy's radar simply could not reliably detect, is what the Pentagon formalized in 1979 under a program called the Advanced Technology Bomber, or ATB. It's a remarkable admission buried inside that program's very existence. After decades of an arms race built on speed, altitude, and raw firepower, the United States had concluded that none of those things mattered anymore if the enemy could always see you coming. The next generation of strategic bomber wouldn't win by outrunning its opposition. It would win by not being there at all, as far as any sensor could tell. And it's what, in 1981, brought Northrop back into the room. Chapter 3: The Return of a Discredited Idea. Here's the twist nobody in the 1940s could have predicted. The very feature that had doomed the flying wing the first time around. Its lack of a tail. Its total absence of large, flat, vertical, or sharply angled surfaces was precisely the shape that made it exceptionally good at deflecting radar energy rather than reflecting it straight back to its source. Northrop, the company, dusted off the flying wing concept and entered it in the ATB competition. In October 1981, they won the contract. The idea the Air Force had once canceled so thoroughly that they destroyed the physical evidence of it was now, 3 decades later, about to become the most classified aircraft program in the country. It did not come cheap, and it did not come easy. Research and development alone consumed roughly $23 billion by 1989, a staggering figure for a program that hadn't yet produced an operational squadron. Midway through the 1980s, the Air Force fundamentally changed the requirement, shifting the design's primary attack profile from high-altitude penetration to low-altitude, terrain-hugging flight, forcing engineers to resolve major structural and aerodynamic problems mid-program. That single change in doctrine added roughly 2 years and $1 billion to a project that was already staggeringly expensive. And underneath all of that spending, the same unsolved problem that had killed the flying wing the first time. How do you make an inherently unstable airframe controllable enough to trust with a crew? With nuclear weapons, with missions lasting dozens of hours over hostile territory. Northrop's engineers in the 1940s never solved that problem. They didn't have the tool that would eventually solve it. Nobody did. Not yet. It's worth appreciating just how much institutional nerve it took to greenlight this program at all. Every engineer working on the ATB in the early 1980s would have known the history, would have known that the last time the US government tried to build an operational flying wing, it ended in a fatal crash, a runway accident, and a fleet ordered destroyed. Signing off on billions of dollars to try again, on a shape with the same fundamental instability problem, required a level of confidence in a still unproven control technology that, on paper, looked like exactly the kind of bet that had already failed once. Chapter 4: The Machine That Tamed the Wing. The tool that finally solved Jack Northrop's 40-year-old stability problem wasn't aerodynamic at all. It was computational. By the 1980s, engineers had access to something the designers of the XB-35 and YB-49 could only have dreamed of. Digital fly-by-wire flight control, and specifically a quadruplex system, 4 independent digital computers, each continuously processing sensor data and making tiny control adjustments faster and more precisely than any human pilot ever could. Where a 1940s test pilot had to physically sense the flying wing drifting off course and manually correct it, exhausting himself in the process, the B-2's computers were making that same correction dozens of times per second, invisibly, before a human being would even register that anything had moved. This is worth pausing on, because it reframes the entire story. The B-2 Spirit weighs more than 336,000 pounds fully loaded, and has no vertical tail whatsoever. By every rule of thumb that governed aircraft design for the previous half-century, that shouldn't be flyable at all. It is flyable purely because the pilots are not actually flying the control surfaces directly. Every input they make is interpreted, filtered, and executed by computer, specifically engineered to prevent the airframe from ever reaching the kind of uncontrolled departure that doomed its 1940s ancestor. And the computers don't just handle routine flight. Without a vertical tail, the B-2 has no rudder in the traditional sense. Nothing to directly counteract sideways yaw. Instead, engineers gave it split-drag rudder surfaces at the wingtips, sometimes called deceleron systems, that open on one side to create extra drag and pull the nose back into alignment whenever turbulence or an asymmetric event tries to knock the aircraft off course. It's an elegant workaround for a missing part, but it only works because a computer is deciding, continuously and automatically, exactly how much drag to apply, and on which wingtip, faster than any human reaction time could manage. The fuel system adds another layer of complexity most people never think about. The B-2 carries roughly 167,000 pounds of fuel inside its wings, burning through it at a rate of around 10 pounds per hour. As that fuel burns off, the aircraft's center of gravity is constantly shifting, and on a tailless flying wing, a shifting center of gravity is not a minor housekeeping issue. It's a direct threat to controllability. So the flight computers are continuously redistributing fuel between tanks and recalculating control inputs to keep the aircraft balanced, a task happening silently, in the background, for every single minute of every mission. And then there's the moment that puts the most stress on the entire system: weapons release. When the bomb bay doors open to release as much as 40,000 pounds of ordnance, the aircraft experiences a sudden, violent change in both aerodynamics, a new gap in the smooth undersurface that the whole stealth shape depends on, and weight, as tens of thousands of pounds instantaneously leave the airframe. The flight control computers have to react to both changes simultaneously and instantly, correcting the aircraft's attitude before a human pilot could even process that the bombs had left the aircraft. Every one of these systems exists to solve the exact same problem that grounded the YB-49 in the 1940s. An airplane with no tail wants, by its very nature, to tumble out of controlled flight. The B-2 doesn't fix that tendency. It simply outcomputes it continuously for the entire length of every mission. There's a sobering flip side to that arrangement, one the engineers understood clearly even as they built it. A flying wing controlled entirely by computer inputs is only as trustworthy as the sensors feeding those computers accurate information. Jack Northrop's original design problem, instability, had been solved. A new, quieter dependency had been created in its place: absolute trust in a chain of sensors, software, and hydraulic actuators that had to work correctly, every time, with no tail and no simple backup method for a human pilot to just muscle the aircraft back under control if that chain ever failed. That dependency would eventually matter far more than anyone wanted it to. Chapter 5, built to disappear, solving the stability problem, only got the B-2 half of what it needed to be. The other half, the entire reason the Air Force had gone back to a discredited 1940s design in the first place, was invisibility. The B-2's strange, faceted, almost alien shape is not an aesthetic choice. Every curve and angle is calculated specifically to avoid presenting flat, perpendicular surfaces to enemy radar. A conventional aircraft, full of right angles and vertical surfaces, reflects radar energy efficiently straight back toward whatever sent it out, which is exactly how radar detection works. The B-2's shape is engineered to do the opposite, to scatter incoming radar energy off in directions that never return to the receiver at all. The result, achieved through a combination of that shaping and classified radar-absorbent coatings, is a radar cross-section reportedly comparable to that of a large bird, an aircraft the length of a mid-size airliner, designed to look, to enemy radar, like something you'd barely glance at twice. The materials involved are just as deliberate as the shape. Much of the B-2's airframe is built from carbon graphite composite structures rather than traditional aluminum, chosen partly for strength and weight, but also because composite materials behave very differently under radar illumination than metal does. Layered over the structure are classified low observable or low coatings, the details of which remain among the most tightly guarded secrets in American military aviation even decades after the aircraft entered service. Even the engines were treated as a detection risk to be engineered away. The B-2's 4 General Electric F-118 engines are buried deep within the wing structure itself, with intake ducts specifically shaped to obscure the compressor blades from radar view, because a spinning set of metal fan blades, if exposed, reflects radar energy extremely efficiently, undoing much of the benefit of the surrounding stealth shape. Exhaust presented its own problem. Hot engine exhaust is a heat signature that infrared-guided weapons can track. So the B-2's exhaust is flattened and mixed with cooler, ambient air along the upper rear surface of the aircraft before it's released, specifically to cool and diffuse the heat signature and make the aircraft harder to lock onto with infrared tracking, as well as radar. Even the weapons themselves disappear into the design. Every bomb and missile the B-2 carries is stored inside 2 internal weapons bays rather than on external hardpoints, because anything hanging beneath the wings, however small, creates the kind of surface irregularity that gives radar something to catch. The entire aircraft, in other words, was built around a single obsessive premise. Nothing about its shape, its structure, or its systems should give an enemy sensor anything to grab onto. What makes this level of obsession remarkable is how invisible the effort itself remains. A casual observer looking at a B-2 on a runway sees a striking, futuristic silhouette. What they don't see is the sheer number of individually solved problems stacked on top of each other to produce that silhouette. The intake shaping solved separately from the exhaust cooling, solved separately from the composite layup process, solved separately from the internal weapons bay geometry. Each one a distinct engineering challenge that had to be resolved without compromising any of the others. Stealth, it turns out, isn't a single feature you bolt onto an airframe. It's a discipline applied to literally every square inch of the aircraft, simultaneously, with zero tolerance for shortcuts. Chapter 6. A dying man sees. His idea vindicated. There's a moment in this story that lands with more weight than almost anything else in the B-2's history, precisely because of how quietly it happened. Before he died, Jack Northrop, by then an old man, decades removed from the humiliation of watching his flying wing concept scrapped and dismantled, was shown a model of what would eventually become the B-2. He was, by most accounts, deeply moved. The idea that had cost him so much, that the institution he'd built it for had so completely rejected it, destroyed the hardware, rather than simply shelving it, had not died after all. It had been waiting, essentially, on hold, for the rest of the world to catch up with what he had already believed decades earlier. He didn't live to see the aircraft fly operationally. He didn't live to see it drop a single weapon in combat. But he lived long enough to see the shape of his life's rejected idea take physical form again, and to understand that history was, eventually, going to prove him right. It's rare for an engineer to get that kind of vindication within their own lifetime, however brief the glimpse. Most discredited ideas stay discredited. Jack Northrop's didn't. It just needed 30 years, a new global threat, and a technology that didn't exist yet to finally catch up to it. Chapter 7. Too expensive to exist in numbers. You might expect that a program this expensive, this technologically important, backed by this much institutional investment, would end with a large operational fleet. It didn't. The Cold War, the entire strategic justification for building an aircraft that could slip past Soviet air defenses undetected, ended before the B-2 program could deliver its full planned fleet. Combined with jaw-dropping projected operating costs, estimates ran as high as $7 to $8 billion a year to sustain the originally planned force. Congress and President George H.W. Bush made the call to slash the total buy from an originally envisioned 132 aircraft down to just 21. Think about the strange economics that decision created. All of that research and development spending, all $23 billion and more, had gone towards solving problems that don't get cheaper just because you build fewer airplanes. The fixed costs of the program, the design, the tooling, the testing, the classified manufacturing infrastructure, had to be absorbed by a fleet roughly 1/6 the size originally planned. Every single B-2 that rolled out of the factory was, by simple arithmetic, carrying a share of the total program cost that dwarfed almost any other aircraft in history. The B-2 reached initial operational capability in April 1997, nearly 2 decades after the ATB program had first been conceived. Arriving into a post-Cold War world, that no longer had the singular Soviet threat it had originally been built to defeat, but that was about to find other very real uses for an aircraft that could not be seen. There's an odd historical footnote worth sitting with here. The aircraft had been designed, funded, and largely built to solve a problem, penetrating the dense, layered Soviet air defense network that had effectively ceased to exist by the time the airplane was ready to fight. The Soviet Union, that the entire ATB program had been engineered around, dissolved in 1991, 6 years before the B-2 was even declared operational. In a very real sense, the B-2 spent its entire development answering a question the world had already stopped asking by the time it had the answer ready. Chapter 8, First Blood over the Balkans. The B-2's combat debut came in 1999 during Operation Allied Force over Yugoslavia, and it arrived in a form almost nobody outside the program had anticipated. Not a short regional sortie, but 2 B-2s flying a continuous 31-hour round-trip mission directly from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, crossing the Atlantic, striking targets, and returning home without ever landing at a forward base. Set that number against the scale of the entire air campaign. Out of roughly 34,000 total NATO sorties flown during that operation, the B-2 fleet flew only around 50. And yet, from that tiny sliver of the total mission count, B-2s delivered roughly 11% of all the ordnance dropped during the campaign, a wildly disproportionate share for a handful of aircraft flying an almost invisible fraction of total sorties. Part of what made that possible was the combat debut of a new weapon carried by the B-2, the Joint Direct Attack Munition, or JDAM, a satellite-guided bomb kit that pushed strike accuracy to roughly 90%, a leap forward from the far less precise weapons that had defined most of aerial bombing history up to that point. But precision guidance is only as good as the coordinates it's guided to, and that's where this chapter of the story takes a devastating turn. A targeting intelligence failure led one B-2 strike to hit the Chinese embassy in Belgrade instead of its intended target, killing 3 people and wounding 20 others. It became one of the most serious diplomatic incidents of the entire campaign, a stark, painful reminder that even the most technologically dominant weapon system in the world is still only as accurate as the human intelligence process that tells it where to aim. All the stealth shaping, all the satellite guidance precision in the world could not correct for a wrong set of coordinates entered upstream of the actual strike. It's a pattern that would echo through the rest of the B-2's operational history in different forms. Time and again, the aircraft's technical performance would prove nearly flawless at the exact task it was built for. Arriving undetected, delivering munitions with startling precision, while the surrounding human and mechanical systems supporting that mission carried risks the airframe's own brilliance could never fully insulate it from. A perfect stealth shape does not guarantee perfect targeting data. A perfect flight control computer, as the world would later learn at Guam, does not guarantee perfect sensor input. Chapter 9. The human cost of a 40-hour mission. If Kosovo introduced the B-2 to combat, Afghanistan and Iraq showed the world what sustaining that combat capability actually demanded from the 2 human beings inside the cockpit. Missions during the 2001 Afghanistan campaign and the 2003 Iraq War regularly pushed past 40 hours in duration, a length of time that is almost difficult to comprehend for a 2-person crew confined to a cockpit that was never designed with long-duration comfort as a priority. There is no separate crew rest compartment on the B-2, nothing resembling the bunk areas found on larger, older bomber designs. Instead, crews had a small space behind the 2 pilot seats just large enough for 1 person to lie down at a time, alternating rest periods between the 2 of them, while the other continued to fly and monitor a fully computerized, highly complex aircraft carrying nuclear-capable ordnance across the world. Basic bodily needs, so easy to take for granted, became part of the mission planning. A chemical toilet, a small microwave for warming food during a flight that could stretch across nearly 2 full days, if you counted planning and transit alongside the flight itself. Crews flew these missions not as an occasional extreme case, but as a routine feature of how the B-2 was actually employed once the Cold War justification for its existence had given way to a new set of global conflicts requiring exactly the kind of long-range, direct-from-home base strike capability the aircraft had, almost by accident, turned out to be extremely good at. By 2003, the B-2 fleet had dropped more than 15 million pounds of munitions in combat, and in December of that year the program officially reached full operational capability, a formal declaration that arrived years after the aircraft had already been proving itself in some of the longest, most physically demanding combat missions any aircrew in the world was flying. It's worth pointing out how strange this operational model actually is compared to almost every other combat aircraft in history. Fighter pilots typically operate from forward bases, close to the fight, flying shorter sorties and returning to rest between missions. B-2 crews, by contrast, were routinely launching from the American Midwest and striking targets on the other side of the planet without ever touching down on foreign soil. A direct consequence of just how few B-2s existed and how difficult it was to forward base an aircraft this sensitive to humidity and temperature. The extreme endurance demanded of B-2 crews wasn't an unfortunate side effect of the mission. It was, in a very real sense, a direct cost of the same fragility that made the aircraft so difficult and expensive to maintain anywhere but home. Chapter 10. The fragility nobody talks about. Here's the part of the B-2 story that rarely makes it into the highlight reel, and it's arguably the most important reverse-thinking twist of the entire program. An aircraft engineered to be nearly invulnerable to detection turned out to be almost unbelievably vulnerable to something as mundane as weather. The same radar-absorbent coatings and composite surfaces that make the B-2 nearly invisible to enemy sensors are extraordinarily sensitive to humidity, moisture, and temperature. This isn't a minor maintenance footnote. It fundamentally shapes how the aircraft has to be operated. After nearly every flight, each B-2 requires meticulous, segment-by-segment inspection of its outer surfaces inside climate-controlled hangar facilities, because exposure to the wrong environmental conditions can degrade the very coatings the aircraft's entire survivability depends on. The maintenance numbers that resulted are staggering by any standard in military aviation. In 1997, every single hour the B-2 spent in the air required roughly 119 hours of maintenance on the ground to support it. That ratio means a fleet of just 21 aircraft demands an enormous, specialized logistics and maintenance apparatus, built almost entirely around protecting a stealth coating from the weather. When the Air Force deploys a B-2 overseas, they cannot simply park it in a standard hangar the way they would almost any other aircraft. They bring portable, climate-controlled shelters specifically built to protect the airframe's surfaces, at a cost of roughly $2.5 million per shelter, an enormous, dedicated infrastructure investment required just to keep one aircraft's skin in flyable condition while it's away from home. Think about the irony sitting inside that fact. The B-2 was built to defeat the most sophisticated air defense network on the planet. It very nearly gets defeated by condensation. This is the reverse-thinking heart of the entire B-2 story. Worth stating plainly, every design decision that made the aircraft nearly undetectable, the exotic composite structures, the classified coatings, the total absence of the redundant, forgiving margins that older aircraft built in, also made it one of the single highest maintenance aircraft ever fielded by any Air Force in the world. Stealth and simplicity turned out to be almost directly opposed goals. You could have an aircraft that was easy to maintain, or you could have an aircraft that was nearly invisible to radar, but pushing hard toward one of those goals meant pulling hard away from the other. The B-2 chose invisibility, without compromise, and the maintenance bill for that choice has been paid every single day of its operational life. Chapter 11. Guam, 2008. When moisture brought down a billion-dollar bomber, that irony stopped being theoretical on February 23, 2008 at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. A B-2 nicknamed the Spirit of Kansas crashed almost immediately after takeoff. The cause traced directly back to the vulnerability built into the aircraft's own sensitive systems. Moisture had intruded into the airflow data sensors, feeding the flight computers inaccurate information about the aircraft's actual state in the air. Remember what we established earlier. The B-2 does not fly on raw pilot input. It flies on computer-mediated corrections drawing on exactly this kind of sensor data. When that data was corrupted, the flight computers, doing precisely what they were designed to do, responded to bad information as though it were good information. The result was a violent, unrecoverable pitch-up, the nose of the aircraft rotating skyward roughly 30 degrees, followed almost immediately by an aerodynamic stall. Both pilots ejected safely. The aircraft itself was destroyed, a total loss of a machine valued at roughly $1.4 billion, making it, at the time, the most expensive aircraft accident in history. Sit with the full shape of that irony for a moment, because it's the entire B-2 story compressed into a single incident. An aircraft built at almost unimaginable expense, specifically to defeat the most advanced, most lethal air defense systems ever constructed. An aircraft that had already flown successfully through hostile airspace in the Balkans, through combat over Afghanistan and Iraq, was ultimately brought down not by an enemy missile, not by an interceptor, but by water vapor finding its way into a sensor before the aircraft ever left the ground. The same extreme sensitivity that made the B-2 nearly invisible to radar also made it catastrophically vulnerable to something as ordinary as humid air. Recall the dependency we flagged earlier, back when the flight control computers were first taming Jack Northrop's inherently unstable shape. A tailless aircraft flying entirely on computer-mediated inputs is only as reliable as the sensors feeding those computers. At Guam, that dependency broke in the worst possible way. The computers did not malfunction. They performed exactly as designed, applying aggressive corrective inputs in response to the data they were given. The failure wasn't in the decision-making. It was in the information the decision-making was based on, a distinction that mattered enormously to investigators, and one that reveals just how completely the B-2's safety rests on the integrity of systems most passengers, and even most pilots, never think to question. Chapter 12, Whiteman, 2022. The second loss 14 years later, on December 10, 2022, disaster struck the B-2 fleet again, this time at its home base of Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, during landing rather than takeoff. A B-2 experienced a hydraulic system failure while coming in to land. The right landing gear failed to lock into position properly, and when the aircraft touched down, that wing came down onto the runway itself, grinding against the pavement. The friction and impact tore open a fuel tank, and the resulting fire produced a significant explosion right there on the runway. The damage exceeded $300 million, and this time, rather than committing the resources to a full repair, the Air Force made a different calculation than it had after Guam: retire the airframe outright rather than fix it. That decision, finalized in 2024, quietly shrank the already tiny operational B-2 fleet down to just 19 aircraft, a fleet that had started life planned at 132, been slashed to 21 before it ever flew a combat mission, and was now down to under 20 after two separate accidents rooted, in different ways, in the same fundamental tension between extreme technological sophistication and everyday operational fragility. Look at the two accidents side by side and a pattern emerges that neither incident alone quite reveals. Guam was a sensor failure feeding a computer system that then did exactly what it was told. Whiteman was a mechanical hydraulic failure in the landing gear, a far more conventional type of aviation accident that could, in principle, happen to almost any aircraft. But layered on top of an airframe already operating with essentially zero margin for error, a fleet so small that losing even one aircraft represents a 5% reduction in total national stealth bomber capacity, Even an ordinary mechanical failure becomes an extraordinary strategic loss. A larger fleet absorbs an accident. A fleet of 19 cannot. Chapter 13. The most expensive ghost in the sky added all up. And the numbers become almost difficult to process rationally. The full program, from initial research through the fielded fleet, cost close to $50 billion. For a total operational force that never exceeded a few dozen aircraft and has since shrunk further. Operating costs run past $100,000 for every single hour any B-2 spends in the air. A figure driven directly by that punishing maintenance ratio and the specialized climate-controlled infrastructure the aircraft requires wherever it goes. By almost any conventional cost-effectiveness measure, the B-2 program looks close to indefensible. A design descended from an aircraft the Air Force itself destroyed in the 1940s, built at staggering expense, fielded in a fraction of its planned numbers, twice destroyed in accidents, rooted in its own extreme sensitivity, and requiring an entire dedicated logistics ecosystem just to keep its skin intact. And yet the B-2 remains one of the most strategically important aircraft the United States operates, precisely because no adversary has ever developed a reliable way to detect and intercept one in flight. Its ability to penetrate the most heavily defended airspace on the planet and deliver a strike without ever being seen coming is not a capability that can be measured purely in dollars per flight hour. As of late 2024, the aircraft continues to be modernized rather than retired outright, including integration of the new B-6112 precision-guided nuclear bomb, a signal that, despite everything the airframe has cost and everything it has broken, the Pentagon still considers its core capability irreplaceable for now. Chapter 4TN. Passing the torch. Every aircraft this expensive and this singular eventually needs a successor, and the B-2s is already being built. The B-21 Raider, currently in flight testing, is explicitly designed to inherit the B-2's stealth mission while avoiding the operational fragility that has defined so much of its predecessor's history. The Air Force plans to acquire at least 100 B-21s, nearly 5 times the size of the entire B-2 fleet, at a target cost of roughly $692 million per aircraft, a fraction of what each B-2 effectively cost once the full program price was divided across just 21 airframes. Just as importantly, the B-21 has reportedly been engineered from the outset for easier maintenance, aiming to avoid the crushing 119 hours of upkeep per flight hour ratio that has shaped nearly every aspect of how the B-2 fleet actually operates day to day. Closing. The idea that refused to stay dead. Let's return, one more time, to where this story actually began. A discredited aircraft, its underlying concept declared a failure, physically torn apart on the order of the very institution that had once believed in it. Jack Northrop's flying wing wasn't shelved, it was erased as thoroughly as the Air Force knew how to erase anything in the 1940s. And it came back anyway. Not because anyone changed their mind about the aerodynamics, but because the world changed around the idea until its greatest weakness, a total absence of the kind of surfaces a radar can easily detect, quietly became its single greatest strength. It came back because computer technology finally arrived that could do what no 1940s test pilot's hands and instincts ever could: hold an inherently unstable shape steady thousands of times a second, for missions lasting nearly 2 full days at a stretch, and it came back at a cost. In dollars, in operational fragility, in 2 separate destroyed aircraft, that makes it one of the most expensive vindications in the history of American engineering. Jack Northrop believed the future of flight belonged to a single wing, stripped of everything he considered unnecessary. The Air Force disagreed so completely they destroyed the evidence. 40 years later, wearing a coat of classified radar-absorbent material, and controlled by 4 computers making decisions faster than any human ever could, his discarded idea became the most feared, most secretive, most technologically dominant bomber ever built. Proof that in engineering, just like in history, being wrong for your own era and being wrong forever are not always the same thing.